What if I told you that your entire way of language learning is wrong, and that trying to learn a language is the whole reason you're not fluent yet? It's not that the language you're learning is too hard, that you gotta study more, or that you're just not talented enough. It's actually only because you don't know the crucial difference between learning and acquiring language. You probably think that language learning is all about studying really hard and memorizing things, just like they taught you in school. But there's a better, seemingly lazy approach to language learning, way more effective than its traditional counterpart, and that's called comprehensible input. You probably know that practically no one has achieved the kinds of results that you want to achieve from traditional study. That there's a bunch of people who sit in front of textbooks all day and take language classes and struggle for years trying to memorize different verb conjugations, while others seemingly learn a language and have no problem understanding it at all. And the reason for this is due to comprehensible input.
We acquire language in one way and only one way, when we understand messages. We call this comprehensible input.
To put it simply, this is really just a term for any piece of language that's at least partly comprehensible to you. It could be anything from a full 2-hour movie where you understand maybe 5 to 10% of what's being said, to a short sentence where you understand all the words in it. The beauty of comprehensible input is that it's by far the most natural way to acquire a language. And I'd say the only way where you can actually acquire rather than learn a language, which are two vastly different things that often get lumped together. And I believe that not knowing the difference between learning and acquiring a language is one of the biggest reasons for people's lack of results. So let's go over the main differences between the two, starting off with the skill building approach, which is the most common one and one that we've probably all tried before. This is the way that most language learning apps and textbooks are set up, and it's generally the one that people do in schools, and it's the most common one overall. Now, the way that this works is that you essentially try to memorize things and learn grammar rules, vocabulary, and you try to do a lot of speaking as well. The issue with this approach is that you're essentially just force-fed a bunch of rules and a bunch of unnatural language, if you will, and from there expected to drive a fluent understanding of the language, which is not really realistic at all. The reason this doesn't really work is that it takes what's a natural, subconscious, and sort of instinctual process and makes it this highly technical, complex, intellectual activity where you're forced to remember a bunch of rules and think about, is this supposed to be there or here? And in reality, language is supposed to be something that you just say on the fly and you're able to use it correctly without having to think much at all. It's like if your goal was to join the UFC and become a professional MMA fighter, but the way that you're gonna do that is by training a bunch of different martial arts separately. You're never gonna spar, and instead you're just gonna hit the heavy bag, you're gonna hit some pads, and you're gonna do a few takedowns versus a sparring partner that isn't really resisting at all. Yes, you'll learn a few things. You'll probably learn how to throw a decent punch and kick, maybe a couple takedowns if you're lucky, but what about when the person is resisting? What about trying to take someone down when they're trying to punch you? And that translates pretty well to language learning. Yes, you can learn a word in isolation, but what about when a native speaker is speaking it very quickly towards you? What about when you yourself is going to have to respond with something that you haven't really learned? What about slang? What about all these different concepts that will come up in your conversations that you haven't prepared for? You can't memorize every single piece of grammar that there is in a language, and even if you do that, how are you going to respond instinctually? You just can't. I mean, you go from having learned your native language by just listening to it for thousands of hours, and getting to the point where you've acquired so much that you can speak about practically any topic at any time without much thought, to now trying to learn a language while looking in a textbook and memorizing grammar rules, then trying to recall them in the middle of a conversation when you yourself aren't even familiar with them yet. And you think doing more of this will get you fluent? I don't think so. So this is where you gotta sit back and really look at the outcome you want to achieve, how it's been achieved before, and the nature of those results themselves. And that's where the skill building approach kinda falls flat on its head. You wanna get fluent, but you do the same thing that everyone in school did that got them absolutely nowhere. Instead of doing the thing that every single native speaker of every language have done, and the people who've moved to another country and gotten fluent in that language did. And fluency naturally means that your understanding of that language and your conversations in the language will flow naturally. Yet you do the least flow-like activity there is, which is staring at a blank piece of paper, looking at this word saying, oh, apple means this in that language. I'll think about that the next time I have a conversation. It's not really gonna work, is it? So instead of this, the solution is to just focus on comprehensible input, which will actually get you the results that everyone hopes for when they start learning a new language. And the way to do this is by essentially completely immersing yourself in that language and switching as much as possible of the stuff that you're currently consuming in your native language now to your target language instead. The practical application of this would be stuff like maybe listening to a podcast in that language while you're doing other stuff, and when you have some time over, sit down and watch a movie or a YouTube video in that language without any English subtitles. And when you're doing this, really try your best not to worry about grammar or any kind of rules at all, and just sit back and relax, because your brain will do the work for you. Spending your time doing these kinds of activities will yield exponentially better results in the long term than sitting in front of some boring textbook or using a mediocre app. And that's not to say that these things can't be useful, because I think they are. It's just that you want to make your default language learning activity doing something with comprehensible input instead of the typical skill building approach type of activities that you probably know don't really work well by now. And so if you want to take your language learning really seriously and really get fluent, then I recommend you click on the video on the screen right now, which is a full guide covering all you have to know about comprehensible input. I'll see you guys there, and thanks for watching.